You don't think about how quickly things can go wrong until it happens. It was supposed to be an easy drive, but on a night like this, nothing is easy. My partner and I have been having it rough in our relationship. I found out months back that she'd been seeing her boss's husband, and this strained our relationship so badly that I thought we were over. We were actually, until she said she'd go for counseling, and she did, but it didn't do much for our relationship, and so a friend of mine suggested a road trip and a small vacation to help us rekindle our relationship. I agreed. Looking back now, I really shouldn't have. When we set out for the road trip, the road stretched on. It was empty except for us. No exits, no signs of life. Just the storm, swallowing everything in its path. We told ourselves it was just another winter storm, that as long as we kept moving, we'd make it to the other side. But the storm wasn't slowing down, and neither were we. And then we crashed. The crash was bad, but the silence that followed was worse. The engine had stalled, we were stuck, and the temperature inside the car was already dropping. There was no way to call for help. No one knew we were out here, and the storm was getting worse with every passing minute. We didn't have many options. Stay in the car and freeze, or step out into the storm and hope for the best. Neither felt like the right choice. We thought we were alone, out here, miles from anything. But then, we weren't. Out of nowhere, he appeared. A man, alone, walking through a storm that could kill you in minutes. He said he'd seen our car from the road. He told us he could help. He said he had a cabin nearby, warmth, shelter, and a phone to call for help. We knew it was risky, but staying put wasn't an option. So we followed him. The path was narrow, the snow almost up to our knees. He moved ahead of us, barely saying a word. Every step took us farther from the car and farther from what little safety we had left. It's amazing how fast desperation can override common sense. When you're freezing, exhausted, and terrified, you start to cling to anything that looks like hope. That's how we ended up following a stranger into the woods that night. And that's how we found the shack. I remember questioning every step. The snow was relentless, the cold cutting through our coats like it wasn't even there. He told us his cabin was close, just a little farther. We wanted to believe him. We had to. When we saw it, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even livable. But the cold was unbearable, and going back to the car wasn't an option. So we went inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was thick and metallic, like rust and decay, and it clung to everything. At first, I told myself it must have been an old hunting shack. But then I saw the table. There was blood, too much blood, and not just on the table. It was on the floor, smeared into the cracks leading toward the back wall. I wanted to look away, but my eyes caught something worse. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew better. These weren't deer bones or anything else you'd find in the woods. They were human. He didn't say much, just stood there, watching us, like he was waiting for something. The cold didn't even seem to bother him, but I could feel it crawling into my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then I noticed the door. There was something behind that door, something I didn't want to see. I could feel the weight of it, the same way you can feel someone watching you in the dark. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. He then breaks the silence and goes, "I will get some firewood. Wait here." I didn't trust him, I couldn't. But before I could say anything, I saw him through the window. He wasn't out there for firewood. He was waiting, watching, and we were trapped inside. I didn't say anything, but my stomach knotted the second he stepped out. There was something off about the way he moved, too calm, too deliberate. I leaned forward, straining to hear through the thin walls. The wind drowned out most of it, but his voice cut through in low, hurried bursts. I heard him say, "Yeah, I've got 2 of them. The car's stuck. They won't be going anywhere." There was someone out there with him. My heart slammed in my chest. 2 of us? My eyes shot to the door, then to my partner across the room. Her expression mirrored mine, confused, scared. I motioned for her to stay quiet as I edged closer to the wall. He continued, "No, just come quick. It's already late. Same place as before." I froze. Same place as before? What did he mean by that? My mind raced, but I couldn't piece it together. He kept pacing outside, his voice sharp but quiet, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. I felt my partner grab my arm, her grip tight and trembling. My partner whispered, "Did he just say 2 of them? Who's he talking to?" I shook my head, too stunned to answer. My ears strained for more, but all I could hear now was the wind swallowing his words. Then suddenly silence. I stepped back, just as the door creaked open, the cold rushing in again as he walked back inside. He stomped the snow off his boots, then he looked at us, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. And then he said, "The storm's getting worse out there. Looks like you'll be staying a while." I forced a nod, my mouth too dry to speak. My partner didn't say anything either, but I could feel her unease. As the door latched behind him, I glanced toward the window, wondering if we'd just made the worst mistake of our lives. We had to think of a way out, and we had to do it now. Almost on cue, he stepped out again, this time to smoke. It was now or never, and so we snuck out quietly, just as we came and made for the woods. Our paces picking up as we increased the distance between the cabin and our backs, we began to run. My legs were screaming, and every breath felt like fire in my chest, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The thought of that shack, of him, was enough to keep me moving. I clutched the fire poker tighter in my frozen hand, even though I wasn't sure what I'd do if he caught up. Behind us, the darkness of the woods stretched on, silent and endless. Was he following us? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. "Gotta find the road, anything," my partner said. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was raw from the cold air and the panic that hadn't let go since we bolted. The snow swallowed every sound, but I swore I could hear faint crunches behind us, like footsteps. I didn't dare look back. My partner's hand brushed mine, her fingers trembling as much from fear as the cold. After what felt like hours, we slowed down, gasping for air. My partner fumbled for their phone, holding it up like a lifeline. I did the same, my frozen fingers clumsy on the screen. My partner asked, in sheer desperation, "Anything? Please tell me you've got something." I stared at the screen, my heart sinking at the mocking words. "No service?" My partner cursed under her breath, and I felt the weight of our situation press down even harder. We had no idea where we were or how far we'd gone. Then a flicker. A single bar appeared in the corner of my screen, weak but real. My heart jumped. I almost dropped the phone as I scrambled to unlock it. The first number that came to mind was my cousin. It rang twice before his voice came through. I could hear his sleepy voice on the other side of the phone as he picked the call and said, "Hello." I replied, almost out of breath now, "It's me. We're in trouble, stuck in the woods. Near the pass, I think. Please, just call the police and come get us." I could picture him sitting up now, filled with worry, as he replied with concern, "Wait, what happened? Are you okay?" And to this I replied, "No time, just get here, now." I hung up before he could ask more questions. The snow was coming down harder now, and my phone's battery was already draining fast. I looked at my partner, who gave me a weak nod. We kept moving, hoping the call would be enough. It was. As some 43 minutes later, my partner and I were seated in the back seat of a police van, wrapped in blankets, our faces pale and exhausted. I couldn't stop shaking. Part of it was the cold, but most of it wasn't. The officers had been asking questions for what felt like forever, but I barely heard them. My mind kept going back to the shack, to his voice with the other man, to the way he had watched us like he was waiting for something. From what the police could gather days after the incident, when they rang to tell us that there have been reports for years, people disappearing along this stretch of highway, and how our descriptions match a man they've been trying to track for a long time. The shaft was empty when they got there, as expected, but he was still out there, somewhere in those woods, in the dark and the cold, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of trusting him. I gripped my partner's hand, feeling the warmth of their fingers against mine. We were alive. But I couldn't shake the thought of how close we'd come to not making it out at all. I thought the car ride would be uneventful. It was just a way to save money and get home for the holidays. 4 strangers packed into a freezing SUV, each of us focused on the road ahead. I can still feel the cold from that night. Not just on my skin, but deeper, like it had settled somewhere inside me. And even now I can't shake the thought. Some of us walked into that storm with secrets. Only one of us walked out. I'd just finished finals, and all I could think about was getting back home. The campus was quiet, the usual hustle gone now that the holidays had arrived. I didn't want to deal with the hassle of booking a bus or paying for a pricey ticket, so I figured I'd carpool with a group of strangers I found on an online forum. The rideshare would save me a few bucks, and honestly, I was just too exhausted to think much beyond that. I squeezed into the back seat of an old SUV that looked like it had seen better days. The weather forecast called for snow, and I could feel the tension hanging in the air as the wind picked up outside. I glanced at the others in the car. Mark, the driver, was in his early 30s, his face hard to read beneath the dim light of the dashboard. He didn't say much, his eyes fixed on the road, as if he didn't care much for conversation. Then there was Sarah. She sat up front next to Mark, chatting away as if the weather or the storm outside didn't matter. Her voice bubbled through the car, overly enthusiastic. She was probably the type of person who thought small talk was the key to making friends, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to respond. Kevin, who sat next to me in the back, hadn't spoken much since we left. He kept his head down, staring out the window with a nervous energy, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. I couldn't help but wonder what was on his mind. The snow was starting to fall heavier now, clinging to the windows. I turned my attention back to the road. Mark's knuckles tightened on the wheel as he sped up, the tires skidding slightly as the snowflakes blurred in front of us. "So, where are you all headed?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the tension, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping in. I gave a quick reply, just trying to make the conversation feel natural, but the cold silence from Kevin in the back seat lingered. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of us, the road disappearing under a thick blanket of white. The car swerved slightly, tires slipping on the ice, but Mark's hands remained steady on the wheel, his focus never leaving the road. "So, what's everyone planning for the holidays?" Sarah's voice broke through the quiet, her attempt at small talk feeling more forced than usual. "I'm just going home to my parents," I said, keeping it simple. Kevin's gaze remained fixed on the window, his face pale against the light from the dashboard. He didn't even look up when Sarah spoke to him. "Same here," Sarah said, practically bouncing in her seat. "I think my mum is making a famous pecan pie. Can't wait." Mark didn't say much, but I could feel his eyes flicker to the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking on us, on me, like he was monitoring the mood. His silence was too deliberate, like he was keeping something locked inside. A sudden lurch jerked me back into my seat, the tires sliding on the slick road. Mark cursed under his breath, hands tightening on the wheel. The car veered dangerously to the right, then swerved left before he slammed his foot on the brake. The SUV slid to a halt, the tires grinding against the ice. Mark let out a long breath, rubbing his hands against his face. "This is bad. We need to figure out what to do." "Should we keep going?" Sarah asked, her voice almost too chipper for the situation. But her smile faltered as she glanced around, a nervous edge creeping in. "We can't," Mark muttered, his voice low and tight. "The roads are too dangerous." Kevin finally spoke up, but his voice was barely audible. "Maybe we should just wait it out." I looked around, the weight of the tension pressing down on us. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The abandoned gas station felt like a forgotten relic of some place we shouldn't be. Sarah shifted in her seat, her face taking on a strange, knowing look. "Sometimes it's better to stay lost than to be found," she said, her words cutting through the cold air, sending an odd chill down my spine. I turned to her, half smiling, trying to laugh it off. "What's that supposed to mean?" She just shrugged, her eyes too wide as she stared into the storm outside. "You never know what you might find when you're looking for something you weren't meant to find." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, as I glanced from Mark to Kevin. Kevin looked at Sarah, then at me, then at Mark, back to men, then immediately back to Mark, like his memory just recollected a helpful piece of information. Kevin's voice was shaky, but the words came out sharp. "I know who you are," he said, his eyes locked on Mark in the rearview mirror. Mark didn't respond at first, but I could feel the tension rise in the car. My heart skipped a beat. Kevin's hands were clenched at his sides, his face pale, his breath coming too fast. "I saw your picture," Kevin continued, barely whispering now. "In that article about the double homicide, the one with the winter travelers. You're the guy." Mark's knuckles turned white as his grip tightened on the wheel. The silence stretched longer than it should have, the kind of silence that made my stomach twist in knots. And then Mark's voice, low and calm, came through the air like a knife cutting through the tension. "You shouldn't have said that," Mark said, visibly angry. I barely had time to process what was happening before Mark slammed the door open and yanked Kevin out of the car. The cold wind howled around us, but all I could hear was the rough, guttural sound of Kevin's protest. "No, wait!" Kevin's words were swallowed by the storm as Mark shoved him into the station. Before I could even move, Mark turned on us, his eyes flashing with something darker. He grabbed Sarah and me by the arm, pulling us toward the SUV. "Get back in the car," he ordered, his voice like steel. I struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. Sarah was already starting to panic, her breath coming in quick gasps. But then, just as Mark shoved me into the back seat, Sarah did something I didn't expect. She pulled away from Mark's grasp with surprising strength and spun around to face him. "Enough, Mark," she said, her voice cold and steady. Mark froze, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to control this anymore," she continued. "You're not the one in charge." My heart skipped. What was happening? Mark took a step back, confused, but Sarah didn't flinch. "I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. "You're under arrest for the murders, Mark. You're done." It hit me then. Sarah wasn't just some random passenger. She was the reason we were all in this mess. She wasn't a victim. She was the one who'd been hunting him. She wasn't who she said she was. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't one of us. She'd been pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was working with the law and Mark. He wasn't some innocent driver. He was a criminal, and Sarah had been playing him this whole time. The room feels like it's closing in on me. My breaths quicken. My mind races, trying to understand how. I just wanted to get home. I had done this before when I was broke and trying to get by. It wasn't supposed to turn out this way. The tension in the car exploded as Mark's face twisted in rage. His eyes went wild, and his breath came out in shallow gasps. The chaos erupted around me, but I didn't stop to think. I didn't care if I understood what was happening or who was in charge. I just knew that I needed to get out. Mark's rage was boiling over, his focus on Sarah and me, giving me the perfect chance to bolt. I shoved the door open, stumbling out into the freezing wind before Mark could react. The snow hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the distant sound of yelling, and then gunshots. A sharp crack split the air behind me. I felt my heart hammer against my chest, but I didn't dare look back. The snow was blinding and the wind made it hard to breathe, but I pushed forward, praying that I could outrun whatever was chasing me. My legs burned, my feet slipping beneath me, but I kept moving. I didn't stop until I saw it, a small farmhouse, faintly lit through the storm, like a beacon in the endless white. I stumbled toward it, desperation clawing at me. My fingers were numb, but I banged on the door until it swung open. The park ranger standing inside barely had time to react before I shoved past him, gasping for breath. "There's someone out there," I managed to say between breaths. "You need to call the police now." The owner didn't hesitate. He picked up his radio, his voice low and urgent, as he relayed the message. I collapsed onto the floor, my body finally giving out after the adrenaline had worn off. I could hear the wind howling outside, but for the first time I felt a sliver of hope. Help was coming. When the storm cleared, the authorities found me, wrapped in shaken up, but alive. They searched the area, combing through the snow-covered woods, but there was no sign of Sarah, Mark, or Kevin. The gas station had burned down, reduced to a pile of charred rubble. There was nothing left but ashes and smoke. The SUV was gone, no trace of the people who had been in that car with me. Days passed, and no new leads came in. Kevin, Sarah, and Mark had vanished as if they were never there at all. Was Sarah really undercover, or was it part of the setup? Whatever happened to Kevin, did he make it out alive, or was he part of their crew? Was justice truly served, or did something far darker get left behind in the snow? All these questions and more plague my mind to this day. The winter of 2010 was like nothing I'd ever seen. It wasn't just the snow, this was the kind of cold that bit at your skin, sharp enough to make your bones ache. Every breath seemed to freeze before it even left my mouth. I'd braved plenty of storms, but that night left a memory that still keeps me up at night. I was wrapping up my shift, one last delivery to a remote estate way out in the woods. Just a few more miles and I'd be done. Simple. Little did I know getting to that estate would be the easy part. What was waiting for me when I got there? That was a whole different story. I am a delivery driver, and in December I make more because of the gifting culture during the holidays and festivities. Plus my wife just put to bed some 4 months ago, and I needed every cent that I could make. So on this night, even with the deteriorating weather, I pressed on. my headlights cutting through the thick veil of snow, the road becoming harder to make out with each passing minute. My route was taking me farther into the wilderness. Finally, I reached it, the estate. It stood at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the snow. A large, old place, looking more like a ghost of a home than a living one. No lights in the windows, no movement inside. The place seemed abandoned, but the address matched, and the package had to be delivered. I parked the truck, the engine sputtering slightly in the cold. The package had to go down, and there was no one to sign for it. I left it on the doorstep, turned around, and made my way back to the truck. That's when I noticed it. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the back of the house toward the woods. My heart skipped. The tracks were too clear, too recent. They hadn't been there when I first arrived. I glanced toward the woods, my mind racing. Who else would be out here, especially with a storm raging like this? I should have just gotten in the truck and left, but something tugged at me. The thought of someone or something out there, so close, gnawed at my curiosity. I hesitated, then walked toward the woods. The snow crunched beneath my boots, but the air was too still. My eyes scanned the dark edges of the forest, searching for any sign of movement. I turned, straining to hear over the wind, and that's when I heard it. Another crunch in the snow, this time closer. I froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. My breath caught in my throat as I strained my eyes through the falling snow. Then just on the edge of the trees I saw it. A figure. Tall, covered in snow, standing motionless. My pulse raced. There was no way he could have gotten so close without me hearing him. No way they'd been there the whole time, just watching me. My instincts kicked in. I turned to run, but before I could move more than a few steps, I heard it again. The crunch of heavy footsteps, every step closer. I bolted toward the truck, my breath coming in sharp gasps, the snow biting at my face as I ran. My legs were already burning from the cold, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I reached the truck, hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock the door. I jumped inside, slamming the door behind me, but as I turned the key, the engine sputtered and stalled. I yanked the key again. Nothing. I glanced toward the woods. The footsteps had stopped. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay here, not in the open. The snow was falling faster now, and visibility was almost zero. I twisted the key one more time, praying the engine would catch. This time, it roared to life, and I slammed the truck into gear, kicking up snow as I sped down the road. The headlights barely cut through the storm, the road a faint blur. I barely made it back to town, the storm still howling behind me as the truck's headlights flickered through the falling snow. My hands were stiff from gripping the wheel, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't make sense of. I parked, the engine rattling to a halt, and sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the cold that had seeped into my bones. Inside, the clerk greeted me, his face weary, his voice low. I needed a drink, something to warm me, but I found myself recounting the whole thing to him. The estate, the strange footprints, the figure in the woods. I told him everything. He nodded slowly, eyes wide as I spoke, and then he said it. The words that made my stomach drop. That place? It's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there for months. I froze. The world seemed to shift just for a moment. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to piece it together. How is that possible? I stammered. I just left a package there. Trust me, he interrupted, his voice low, almost like he was afraid to say it. No one's lived there in a long time. It's been empty since the last owner disappeared.
I felt my blood run cold. I didn't know what to think anymore. There was no explanation. No one had been at that house. No one should have been there. I didn't know who was out there.
If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another true winter horror story. Every December night brings new twists, new terror, and a deeper look into the unknown. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced something like this in the cold? Stay tuned for more spine-tingling stories. And remember, in the dead of winter, the scariest things are often hiding just beyond the snow.